In this series, I'm attempting to play and review every single Nintendo 64 game. Today we're looking at all 22 games that begin with the letter C. First up, California Speed. California Speed is an arcade racing game where you race across the state of California over 11 tracks. What's cool about this is that it's not all San Francisco and LA. We see some surprising locations in here. For me as a native Californian, it's fun to see areas I've actually spent time in real life. I've spent so many hours driving up and down these highways, and I can't even tell you how many times I've been on this roller coaster in Santa Cruz. The locations aren't accurately depicted, but they do faithfully capture the essence with some exaggeration to make things more interesting. For example, while driving through the Mojave Desert, you eventually enter a UFO full of aliens. In Silicon Valley, you end up driving through a giant computer. There's a nice selection of cars, although they all seem to handle the same whether you're driving a sports car or a golf cart. You can play through a selection of tournaments in single-player mode or race a friend in two-player split screen. What really makes the game is the tracks. They're interesting, fun to look at, and offer multiple routes. Otherwise, the racing gameplay itself is pretty bare bones, and the music leaves much to be desired. One fun fact about the game is that it features a very creepy billboard in one of the levels that was never actually supposed to be in the game. I'll let you look it up. Overall, I had fun with this title, mostly due to its familiar source material, but there are far better racing games on the N64. Carmageddon 64. Carmageddon 64 is actually the N64 version of Carmageddon 2. It's one of the worst received games on the console. It was controversial back in the day for its violent content and had to go through various kinds of censorship around the world. It plays well enough, but I found it to be very frustrating. I thought the track designs were a little confusing and I kept going down the wrong routes. To be fair, I can't give this a very thorough review because I just didn't understand what I was doing. Am I supposed to be racing, killing zombies, killing my opponents? Nothing really seemed to matter at the end of the race. Another frustrating aspect is that if your car gets wrecked, you have to start the level all over. This can be instantaneous if you happen to hit an explosive barrel or something, and you're supposed to mow down zombies, but this causes damage to your vehicle also. I don't know how I was supposed to kill 80 of them on my first mission. My car blew up after a fraction of that, so I'm guessing I was supposed to just look for weapons to use them. But was I also supposed to win the race at the same time? It was all a little confusing and I just got frustrated. It has several game modes for 1 or 2 players and there are apparently 30 tracks, but I only saw a few of them. I just got too tired of the game to care. If you're a classic metalhead, you might be pleased to know that Iron Maiden created 4 original songs for the game, according to Wikipedia. I'm sure it has its fans and I'm clearly missing the point here, but I also just don't feel like I'm missing out on too much by moving on to the next game. Castlevania. We love to call this Castlevania 64, but it's actually just called Castlevania, and it was the first 3D game in the series. You get to play as one of 2 characters in this gothic action platformer. There's Reinhardt the whip wielder and Carrie the magic user. You'll be taking on tons of skeletons, werewolves, and other familiar foes on your way to defeat Dracula. The game features tons of classic Castlevania weapons and power-ups like throwing knives, holy water, crosses, and axes. One thing this game really nailed is the atmosphere, with haunting sounds, tense music, and hordes of enemies that will keep you on the edge of your seat. It hasn't aged nearly as well as its 2D counterparts, but I think it's also somewhat underrated. It was a victim to many of the common pitfalls of 3D action games of its time, like a clunky camera and controls. It also feels a bit repetitive at times. The platforming elements can be painfully unforgiving. You'll waste a lot of time going back to previous save points after missing a jump and falling to your death. Overall, the game could have been great, it just needed a little more refinement. At first I kinda hated it. The first level was bland and disorienting, and I had a hard time getting the feel of it. But by the time I reached the castle, I was really enjoying myself. Pro tip for beginners, pick the girl. Combat is much easier. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. Castlevania Legacy of Darkness is basically the prequel to Castlevania 64, but it also includes a remixed version of Castlevania 64, so in a way you could call it a definitive version. There are a total of 4 playable characters this time around. It features revamped controls and camera and improved graphics over the original. From the very beginning of the game, it gets off to a much stronger start. Your starting character Cornell feels a lot more powerful than the last game's protagonists. Environments are less confusing and there are way more epic boss fights. I still got lost sometimes though. The platforming elements feel a bit better. Overall it's more of the same, but it's also just slightly improved in every way. If you've been sleeping on the N64 Castlevania games, this is a good place to start. You might be surprised. Center Court Tennis. Center Court Tennis, known in Japan as Let's Smash, is a tennis game from Hudson Soft. You can create your own character, and this was perhaps the most exciting part of the whole experience for me. After careful deliberation, I took my custom character out for an exhibition match, and got wrecked. I had a hard time getting a feel for this game. Not only is it unforgiving, but it's just a little bland in the gameplay department despite having a lot of creative features. You can play singles or doubles matches against the CPU or with up to 4 players, take on a number of other challenges and mini-games to unlock cosmetic items for your character. Everything from the character designs to the music is just so cheerful. It's all oozing with charm, but the gameplay itself is just not that fun. It feels very slow and unforgiving compared to other tennis games. No matter how much I admire its presentation, I just couldn't enjoy playing the game itself. Chameleon Twist. Chameleon Twist is a 3D action platform game in which you play as one of 4 anthropomorphic chameleons. You're just an ordinary chameleon sitting on a log one day when the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland comes running by and jumps into a magical pot. You decide to follow him for some reason and find yourself in another place, your body changed into somewhat of a human form. With no further explanation, you do what you would instinctually do in any platform game. You start running around, jumping, and collecting things. Honestly, this is my type of platforming game. There's nothing too complicated about it, it's not a collect-a-thon. The emphasis is really on the tricky platforming itself, navigating each area and taking out enemies. You only need to worry about collecting things if you want to. You can use your tongue to gobble up bad guys and then spit them out at other enemies Yoshi style. Your tongue can also be used to boost you up to higher platforms and swing from posts. It's not always easy, especially thanks to a camera that works against you much of the time. I can't tell you how many times I was walking down a narrow ledge while the camera insisted on swinging around, making me lose my footing. Other times I simply couldn't judge spatial distance well enough and jumped to my death. But it's a very fun platformer overall with everything you could want in such a game. The graphics are colorful, the gameplay mechanics are simple and addictive, and the music is cheerfully tropical. It's both comforting and frustrating somehow, as it encourages you to keep going with generous lives and unlimited continues. It also features 4-player battle modes, which I didn't get to try out. The game was slammed by critics at the time for being too short, roughly 1.5 hours, and too easy, but it's loved by many fans today. I highly recommend this one for fans of old school 3D platform games. Chameleon Twist 2. Chameleon Twist 2 is more of the same and then some. It begins with the chameleons peacefully playing on a seesaw when the white rabbit falls out of the sky and launches you into another land. This time you look more like a chameleon, at least in the international versions. The Japanese version of the game featured the same classic character designs from the first one. You have some new abilities this time around. Your tongue is stronger than before and can let you latch onto walls, jump on ledges, and swing vertically now. You also have a parasol that lets you glide through the air. Everything just seems a lot more polished this time around. The game feels smoother. The environments are more vibrant, whimsical, and full of character. The same can be said for the enemies. The carnival world puts you up against evil popcorn, ice cream, and even a Big Mac. The stages feel a lot bigger too. No more small rooms to clear out. These feel like big open spaces with even more perilous platforming, only made easier by the parasol. Critics slammed this one too for many of the same reasons as the first game. That is, it's very short and relatively easy. You can call it childish, I'll just call it delightful. Charlie's Blast Territory. Charlie's Blast Territory is a reskinned version of the PS1 game, The Bombing Islands. Instead of a clown, you now play as a construction worker. Also new to this version of the game is a 4-player versus mode, which I didn't get to try out. But this is a puzzle game that involves pushing around blocks and setting off chain explosions. The goal is to blow up all the bombs and TNT crates on the stage. The trick is you'll have to line them up to blow them up at the same time, because you only have one detonation per level. Making things harder are environmental hazards and objects that block you from moving things where you want them to go. It can be a real head scratcher. I'm simply too dumb for these puzzles, and the game couldn't hold my interest for very long. Critics didn't like the game at the time, but if you like a good puzzle, you might enjoy it. Chopper Attack. Chopper Attack is an aerial combat game where you get to fly around in a helicopter and blow stuff up. Sounds good, right? Well, no. It has some good things going for it, but overall I had a pretty miserable time with it. For the most part, you're flying around and trying to blow up objectives before you run out of fuel. Sometimes you'll have hostages to rescue and protect from enemy fire or other friendly vehicles to escort to safety. As much as I dislike escort missions, the problem started way before that. The chopper itself is just a little too hard to control, and the crosshairs are absolutely useless. I've played a video game or two before, and my impression has always been that crosshairs are supposed to indicate where you're aiming. In this game, they really don't. Between missions, you'll get to purchase special ammo and items to help you through the next level. You'll have to budget and choose wisely. You'll earn more money depending on how well you did at the end of each mission. It might have been an okay game, but I ended up rage quitting on an escort mission in the end. The game was just too clunky to put up with anymore. I couldn't keep up with the thing I was trying to escort, I kept getting lost, and it was incredibly frustrating. If the handling and aiming systems were better, it would be a decent game, but as it is, it's one that I will never want to play again. Choro Q 64 2. This is a sequel to Choro Q 64, a game we know as penny racers in the West, and which we'll look at later. It's a racing game based on toy cars with a strong focus on customization. It features Grand Prix, single race, and 4-player versus modes. The game was only released in Japan, but there's a fan translation on the internet, which is what you're seeing now. You can customize and upgrade your car as you go to improve performance or change the look of your vehicle. There's a nice variety of at least 9 tracks, each with customizable weather conditions, and you can even make your own tracks with a built-in track editor. The game features weapons and power-ups just like Mario Kart. You have 28 cars to choose from, including some pretty wacky ones. Overall, this title's pretty impressive with all it has to offer, and it's pretty darn fun also. It was a nice surprise. Chokukan Knight, Pro Yakyuu King. Pro Yakyuu King is a baseball game that only came out in Japan. It features chibi style or super deformed athletes. Honestly, I can't go in depth here with my limited knowledge of Japanese, but it seems like there's a ton of options, stadiums, and team customization features here. The gameplay itself is fairly simple, fast-paced, and fun. It's easy to pick up and play, just like all my favorite baseball games from simpler times. It looks decent enough if you like the chibi designs, and the in-game commentary adds to the atmosphere and excitement. Even without knowing Japanese, you can quickly jump into a game and have a good time. I just can't speak too much on the other features and game modes for lack of understanding and lack of information online. But if you like quirky retro baseball games, check it out. Chokukan Knight, Pro Yakyuu King 2. The sequel to the last game, this one is very similar with a few slight tweaks. It supports up to 4 players and still has a ton of game modes and customization features. This time around you have a few bizarre stadium settings like at the beach or in space, beyond the already sizable selection of regular stadiums. I honestly don't know what else I can say about these games, but they're both pretty fun to jump into. Simple, fast, arcade-style fun. My kind of sports games. ClayFighter 63 1/3. When I was little, I thought ClayFighter on the Sega Genesis was so cool. I loved its claymation art style and wacky characters, and the fighting system was just okay, but it was good enough for me as a kid anyway. I never played another ClayFighter game after that, until now. Let's just say it's another ClayFighter game. The series was never very impressive in terms of gameplay. It relied on its humor and charm to win people over. This one contains 12 characters, including many returning favorites and a couple of welcome cameos from Earthworm Jim and Boogerman. The stage designs are kind of impressive here, with walls you can knock your opponent through, leading to new areas. There's a ton of voice acting in the game. Your fighters simply won't shut up, for better or worse. And the game's narrated by Michael Buffer, the Ready to Rumble guy. It's merely an okay game for casual fighting game fans. The humor really didn't do anything for me, and there's actually some stuff in here that's pretty offensive today. Otherwise, it's a pretty forgettable game that scored badly with critics at the time. ClayFighter Scuptor's Cut. Scuptor's Cut is the definitive version of 63 1/3 with 4 extra characters and additional features. This is one of the rarest and most expensive N64 games today, as it was only ever available exclusively through Blockbuster Video as a rental. According to Wikipedia, only 20,000 copies of the game were ever produced, and as rentals, they were mostly loose cartridges. Complete boxed versions are extremely rare, having only been awarded to winners of a certain contest, and today it might be worth more than your house. It's the holy grail of all holy grails on the N64, but normal people will just emulate it, or not play it at all because it's still a pretty mediocre game. Command & Conker. This one almost needs no introduction. Command & Conker was a hugely successful real-time strategy game that spawned a bunch of sequels. It was released on many platforms over the years, and each one had its own strengths and weaknesses. The N64 version got updated 3D graphics and 4 special missions, but it lacked any kind of multiplayer support or live-action cutscenes. The game consists of 2 different campaigns where you play as one of 2 armies. Each has their own strengths, weaknesses, and stories. The main goal of each level is to build up your base, gather resources, and attack the enemy base. You have many different kinds of buildings you can construct and troops to command. You can choose to destroy enemy establishments or conquer them and make them your own. I don't play a lot of RTS games, so please don't judge me too harshly for this gameplay footage. To be honest, I had no idea what I was doing for a while. But once it started to make sense, I began to really enjoy it. This actually makes me want to get into the genre for once. The N64 controller isn't as convenient or as precise as a mouse and keyboard, but it works okay. For console gamers back in the day, this was as good as it could get. It still holds up, but I would recommend playing it on PC given the choice, especially considering there's a remastered version available now. Conker's Bad Fur Day. One of the more expensive, acclaimed, and infamous titles in the N64 library, Conker's Bad Fur Day was a late release for the platform, coming out in 2001. It was developed by Rareware, one of the console's most important developers. It's a 3D platforming game with action, puzzles, and even shooting elements. It looks innocent enough, but if you know anything about this game, then you know it's not for kids. There's a big warning before you even reach the start screen that it's for mature audiences only. There's actually an interesting story behind this, which is old news, but I'll mention it anyway. It was planned to be a family-oriented game, a sequel to Conker's Pocket Tales on the Game Boy Color. But when the game was unveiled for the first time at E3 in 1998, it received quite the backlash by critics who dismissed it for being just another generic game for children. They wanted a mature game, so Rare went back to the drawing board and spent another 3 years turning this into an almost shockingly mature game, full of profanity, adult jokes, blood and gore, alcohol use, you name it. And it's honestly one of the most hilarious games I've ever played. The cute appearance of it, combined with the classic happy-go-lucky cartoon-inspired soundtrack, make the comedic punches land so much harder. I'm not going to show too much here, but if you're old enough to play it and aren't offended by what I've mentioned so far, then by all means go and play it. Because aside from all that, it's still a very enjoyable game at its core. It's more straightforward and shorter than many of Rare's other games that lean on the collectathon side. But to me, that's a plus. I like to know what I'm supposed to be doing and to be able to progress through the story at a good pace. It's one of the most visually impressive games on the console, very colorful or dark at times, and full of character. It's also fully voice acted and the performances are amazing, sometimes amazingly bad, but purposefully so as to make fun of stereotypical characters in other media. In addition to the main game, there are also 7 different multiplayer modes for up to 4 players. Conker's Bad Fur Day received critical acclaim in its time, but sold poorly, making it an expensive cartridge today. Luckily, it got a remake on the original Xbox called Conker Live and Reloaded, and a remastered port of the N64 original can be found in the Rare Replay package for Xbox One. Both versions are backwards compatible and available on Xbox Series consoles today. Sadly, the planned sequel was cancelled by Microsoft after they acquired Rare, and the rest is history. But Conker's Bad Fur Day and its remake still stand the test of time. Cruis'n USA. Maybe I'm blinded by nostalgia, but I like this game. Back in the 90s, it seemed like either this game or its sequel would be in every single arcade. It was very popular. The N64 port wasn't quite the same as the arcade version, mind you. It was technically inferior, with worse graphics, pop-in, and frame rate issues, which led to criticism at the time. It was also censored in a few areas. Less bikini babes, no references to the Clintons, and no more animals on the side of the road that you could run over. The game is still very fast and twitchy. It doesn't feel like most racing games. It almost feels like you're on rails. I guess Outrun is what it reminds me of most, but without the drifting. Your biggest challenge is not staying on the track, but dodging traffic. The physics don't make any sense whatsoever. You're able to handle sharp turns at 140 miles per hour without even slowing down. And if you crash into or bump into another car, the cars just spin around like crazy for a few seconds and then go back to normal. You start out with only a few cars, but there are some additional cars you can unlock later. It's fun to drive across the USA and see some different scenery, but some of the areas do tend to look the same and it feels like half of the tracks are in California. It's not the best game, but it is good enough to come back to for some quick, simple, mindless fun every once in a while. Cruis'n World. Cruis'n World is the sequel to Cruis'n USA and it's bigger and better in every way. It has way more cars to choose from and the tracks feel bigger and much more interesting. It looks better and runs more smoothly, even the music is so much better. Who doesn't have that theme song ingrained in their minds? This time around you can play with up to 4 players instead of just 2. The game also adds the wheelie boost mechanic. If you double tap the gas you get a speed boost and pop a wheelie, allowing you to run over other cars and do flips in the air. The physics are crazier than ever and I'm sure this is on purpose. It's like bumper cars on steroids. Cars you hit might go flying in the air while you only suffer a little bit of slowdown. You have many more opponents per race this time and the game feels much harder than its predecessor. The first game was almost too easy. This one feels almost too hard in contrast, even on the easiest difficulty. It's still far from perfect, but it's a nostalgic blast that's always fun to come back to every so often. Cruis'n Exotica. Cruis'n Exotica is the final installment of the Cruis'n series as far as the N64 goes. It's probably the best of the bunch too. It looks better technically and artistically. Everything is exaggerated to the extreme this time, from the creepy characters to the random vehicles to the insane tricks you can pull off for extra time. And most notably the tracks, which take you to all kinds of exotic locations on Earth and beyond. Yes, you can even race across Mars on a sort of less colorful rainbow road. This is crazy over-the-top arcade racing, and it really has the spirit of later Midway racing games like Hydro Thunder and Arctic Thunder. It still has some of the same issues from previous entries like low draw distance, but overall I feel like this is the most interesting, polished, and fun title in the trilogy. Custom Robo. Custom Robo is a hybrid RPG and arena brawler. Think Pokemon meets Power Stone. You play as a kid who is just becoming a custom Robo commander. Someone who owns a robot, customizes it with unique parts, and uses it to battle against other people's robots. In between battles, you get to walk around and talk to people like you would in any RPG. The battles themselves are the meat of the game though. They take place in 3D arenas and are actually quite fun. The controls feel great. It's easy to maneuver around in these 3D spaces as you run, jump, dash, and fight with several weapons at a time. Although you only have one analog stick, your robot will basically auto-aim at its opponent regardless of which direction you're moving. Your robot's equipped with a basic gun, bombs, rockets, and a special attack. And all of this can be customized through parts you earn after winning battles. The more you play, the more parts you'll collect, and you can truly make a very unique robot to your liking, and even switch up the parts strategically to help you beat different types of opponents. You can even save your custom robo to a memory pack and take it to a friend's house to play against their custom robo in a 2-player versus mode. The music is catchy and cheerful, the graphics are cute and colorful, and the robots themselves look pretty cool. The look of your robot actually changes dynamically with each part you equip. You get to see each unique part rendered in 3D, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but I found it impressive for a game of its time. I haven't found it to be very difficult so far, although I haven't finished it yet. It's a game that was aimed at kids primarily. I imagine I would have loved this game as a kid if it had been released in the US. But alas, it was a Japan-only release. Luckily, today English speakers around the world can enjoy it to the fullest thanks to a fan translation, which is what you're seeing right now on the screen. I highly recommend checking out this gem of a game on the 64. Custom Robo V2. Custom Robo V2 is a sequel to Custom Robo. It seems to be very similar to the first game, which is not a bad thing at all. This time 4 players can battle it out in tag team matches instead of just 2. Unfortunately, like its predecessor, this game remains a Japan exclusive title. And unlike its predecessor, it has not been fan translated yet. So if you don't understand Japanese, it may be hard to enjoy this one. Personally, I didn't get very far. I only played a few battles and that was it. Fingers crossed for a fan translation. It seems like a quality sequel and I just don't want to try and navigate all the menus and dialogues without understanding them. Shame on me for not keeping up with my Japanese studies over the years. CyberTiger. CyberTiger is an arcade-style golf game starring the legend himself, Tiger Woods. It contains several different game modes and multiplayer support for up to 4 players. The interesting thing about it at the time was its control scheme, which uses the analog stick to swing the club. Pull back on the stick, hold it briefly to determine the power, and then fling it forward to swing. While the ball's in the air, you can actually put a spin on it and sort of nudge it in the direction you want it to go. You also obtain power balls as you play, which have different special attributes like bouncing off water or having additional spin. The graphics are inoffensive, but the sound and music are very repetitive. The N64 version loses the career mode that was in the PS1 release, and it gains a crazy 2-player split-screen battle mode instead, where each player stands on a platform full of explosives and simultaneously tries to hit the other player with golf balls, thus blowing them up. Overall, the game was just okay. There was nothing too exciting about it. It felt sorta lifeless. I'm not the biggest fan of golf, but I have enjoyed a few golf games over the years, and let's just say this one isn't in my top 5. I do give it props for its creativity though. And there you have it, all 22 N64 games that start with the letter C. Next time we'll look at the game starting with the letter D. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.